series of 3 webinars that the NHLI Postdoc and Fellows Committee have organised. So the second one's actually being held as part of the NHLI Friday Science and Culture webinars, and is taking place next Friday, when we have Dr. Ryan Thwaites and Dr. Charis Perklios, and they'll be presenting on how to get funding, a postdoc's fellows perspective. And then the third one that we're currently planning will be with PIs within NHLI who've sat on grant panels, and they'll give their advice and experiences, and you'll have the opportunity again to ask questions, which you will of course today. But key obviously to getting funding is the preparation and the submitting of the grant application itself, which can be quite a daunting process. And so I'm delighted that our first webinar of the trio is being given by Dr. Alun Owen, NHLI's research manager. So just to give a quick bio on Alan, for those of you who perhaps haven't met him in person or do not know him, again, encourage you to look at his PWP. He obtained his PhD in developmental neurobiology from Queen Mary's College London, and then worked for 6 years as a postdoc at King's College. But then he moved on and worked as a scientific programme officer for 6 years at the Wellcome Trust, where he was responsible for the peer review and management of grants submitted to the Neurosciences panel. So he himself has had experience of how, for example, the Wellcome Trust handled the grant application process. We've been very lucky having him within NHLI for 15 years now, and he's a vital part of the administrative team, and with his wealth of knowledge and experience is really the key individual to engage with when you're considering submitting a grant application. And he's going to tell us how to go about doing that and to get grant funding. Over to you, Alan.
Thanks, Miriam. I wasn't quite sure quite what level to pitch this at, so I've sort of done it at a fairly basic level. So hopefully it'll form a good groundwork for everybody for the following 2 seminars that are coming up. So what I'm going to start with is, this is often people's view when they think about putting a grant application together. There's uncertainty, there's confusion, it's a really complicated process. And I think just on its own, that's enough to actually put a lot of people off. What we really need to think about is it as a flow chart and taking each step as it comes. So just starting off with the key thing, which is really the good idea, choosing how you're going to fund that, writing the application, submitting it, and hopefully getting it through a funding committee. And as some of you will be thinking about fellowships, there's also an interview committee to be thinking about as well. And hopefully we'll end up down at the funded end of this. But if not, you know, it's a matter of maybe choosing the right place. Maybe the first one wasn't the right one, or rewriting the application and keeping at it. So I was going to start by just talking about different types of funders, because different funders have different schemes. They have different project types that they prefer over each other. So in general, there are, broadly speaking, sort of 3 types of funder. There's the government agencies. So these are things like Department of Health, the NHS. They're often driven by things outside of research excellence, I think it would be fair to say. So Department of Health will have government mandates for things that they have to achieve. So that may influence the types of research that they're actually supporting one over another. Charities can be general charities. So Wellcome Trust, for example, is very broad church. It supports a lot of different types of research, both in the UK and internationally, more so in lower middle income countries when I say internationally. BHF is focused on, obviously, on the heart, and British Lung Foundation, Asthma UK are obviously working very closely together these days, but still have their own separate funding streams at the moment, are obviously going to be focused very much on respiratory. Industry is a sort of different kettle of fish in many ways. They're going to be funding research which is important to them in general. There are some exceptions to that where they may support research which is seen as almost like a donation and more philanthropic kind of thing. But in general, vast majority of what they do, it's maybe research on their drugs or developing a product which they would then take on. So some of these will have different eligibility criteria. So it might be that as a postdoc applying, you might have to go with a more senior academic to actually make the application, or you may need to have a contract for the duration of the award. And the eligibility of most schemes is pretty clear, and if there's ever any doubt, you can always check with myself or one of your the NHLI section managers. The other things you can think about is the mission and the strategy of the funders. I'll come back to that in a second. There's often subject-specific calls. Obviously, at the moment, we have had a lot of COVID-related calls where a block of money is put into research in a particular area. Some topics are trendy at certain times and maybe drop out of being trendy. AI is a big thing at the moment, so there's particular calls in those areas. So if your research fits that call, that's great. What I would say is don't try and make your research fit a specific call. You'll always be a square peg in a round hole. It won't match. You can spend a lot of time writing an application that immediately gets kicked out because it's not specifically what the call is asking for. And then there's sort of special initiatives. These are slightly different. They're usually very temporary. So maybe the COVID call is a bit more like these at the moment. And sometimes they're more flag areas that they have a particular interest in, but don't ring fence funding for that. So BHF, for example, may say we're particularly interested in electrophysiology in the heart, but they won't put any specific money into that. It would still be out of the general pot. And basically what would happen is when your grant goes to that panel, if it scores the same as a grant on another topic, it would maybe the one that's funded above it because it's part of their special call. And then there's things like the funding climate. We know that some charities, CR UK, for example, are closing down calls at the moment because they're quite concerned that they're not getting much much income in through things like their charity shops, and they're worried that they're not going to have enough funds to support their research. So they're reducing or closing particular rounds of panels. Wellcome Trust may have more money at the moment because the stock markets are running in certain ways. So it can be swings and roundabouts, and it's hard to know at any given time where a particular funder stands. We mentioned strategy earlier. All the funders really have their strategies, and they're all published on their websites. MRC, BHF, and Wellcome, just shown here, just for example. And sometimes by reading through those, you get a real flavour of what it is that they're actually looking to support and where their focus is. And sometimes taking the language that they use in their strategies and repeating it back in their the grant application that you're writing is a way of highlighting the fact that you've taken on board what the funder wants and are combining it with your research in a way that's beneficial to them to fund, as well as for you to do the research. And of course, there's the NHLI strategic plan, which I'm sure you all know inside out. So talking about putting a grant application together. So for those of you who have done this, obviously this will be not new to you, but I know many postdocs and researchers within the department will never have done a grant application before. So hopefully this will give you a flavour of some of the things that are in it, some of the things to watch out for. So there's always a summary of the project. It might be 300 words, it might be 1,000 characters. There'll be something in the grant application to actually outline your project. This is a really, really important part of the application, and some people gloss over it and just put it in at the last minute. I really, really wouldn't advise doing so. When it goes to the panel, you get lots of people on the panel. Some of them will only read the abstract of your project. Others on the panel will read the whole thing, but if you can get across to everybody on that panel how important your research is within the abstract, then you've won over people on the panel. There's also often a lay summary, and even through schemes like the NHLI Travel Awards and the Pilot Awards, we see a lot of lay summaries come through which are still massively complex and massively scientific. So these need a lot of thought, and there are some good links on how to write lay summaries. The PFDC has one, the BHF also has one on their website. So really think about them, pitch it to a Daily Mirror reader was how it's often described to me. Pitch it to your grandma, assuming your grandma's not a clinician or a researcher. Then there'll be something around what your question is. It might be phrased slightly differently, but there's always some way of getting across what is your research question. And you need to get across also why it's important as a question and how it relates to the mission as funders. So we were just talking about that a couple of slides ago. But it's very easy to get bogged down in the detail of the science and not get across what your big question is that you hope to solve going forwards. It's sometimes phrased as a hypothesis, as you can see from the aims. What's the hypothesis? What's its significance? But also aims will also be maybe multi-part. So you have a big overarching question, which is then addressed with a number of separate aims or work packages, or however you want to describe it in your application. Then you need to set the background. So this is the work that has led up to the project. And it's really, really important to give a balanced view of the field. So it might be that there is a paper which contradicts what you're trying to say, and you ignore it and just present the work that supports your ideas. When it goes to the funder, they might send that grant to the person who wrote that other paper. So they'll see it, they'll read it and go, well, hang on, my work here isn't referenced. Why is that? Oh, it's because I contradict them. And you're probably going to get a pretty poor review from that reviewer. So make sure you cover the work, and also make sure you cover how your work incorporates in that, all the pilot data, the preliminary data that you have to support that, that background. And then there's the experimental work, how you're actually going to go about doing it, and actually demonstrating that you've got experience in these things, or you have the right collaborators to actually go about doing it. Things like study size, obviously this is really important for clinical studies, how many patients you've got, or how many animals you're going to use. These are all the sort of things that people look at in the application. And power calculations, again, will be looked at if they're asked for. BHF, I think, asked for power calculations for all their clinical studies. And it's best to speak to somebody before putting those in. The college has the Statistical Advisory Service, who I think give you an hour free when you're preparing a grant application. So why not make use of it and actually go and speak to them and get somebody to actually look at it and give you the proper help you need on that. And then there's often things good to include is some sort of timetable or milestones that you can add into it. A sort of a Gantt chart style illustration is quite helpful, because you can get across quite quickly how the various aims that you outlined at the beginning of the application all fit together, and how one will lead to the next, or how they run parallel to each other, for example. And it's always best to identify any problems before the referees do. So we've been on, as Miriam said, on the welcome panel. People identify it and say, yeah, this is a great project, but this experiment, this first experiment they're going to do, if it doesn't give the results they think, the rest of it is not going to work. So identify those problems and put contingencies in place, and really think about how realistic it is. So if it's 10 years worth of work trying to be compressed into a 3-year project, it's going to get a rough ride through panels. It's not really realistic to expect to be able to do that kind of level of work in the timescale or for the budget that's available. So if there's a cap on the budget that the funder is offering, so for some of the smaller grants that you might be thinking of applying for, it might be 5, 10, 20,000 pounds. How much can you actually achieve with that sort of level of funding? So be realistic about it. Being over ambitious is actually almost as bad as being under ambitious. Then there's a lot of things that you would go and speak to one of the section managers to get details on. These are all the resources. So these are the costs that are associated with the grant application. It might be staff, it might be equipment, animals, access charges. So if you're using film or fax, we have things called FEC charges for some funders, which I'm not going to go into in any way, shape or form in this. And then there'll be financial requirements in terms of sign off. You've probably all heard of InfoEd, which is our costing tool, which needs to be signed off. And research services also usually have to approve grant applications. And I would say probably 95% of the grants we submit now are all online. So there are email or electronic approvals for these steps. And then there might be a whole slew of other things that the funder is requesting. So we have data sharing agreements for the MRC and how you're going to archive your data or how you're going to deposit it on some of the online systems, how you're going to engage with the public and how you're going to disseminate your results. And dissemination is not necessarily about peer-reviewed articles. It could well be about how you're going to communicate the results back to the patients that are taking part in your projects or the public through things like Pints of Science or the college festival. And then there's exploitation, which is how you're going to patent the work and secure intellectual property. And then for those of you thinking about fellowships, there's often personal statements that you have to include. You have to think about who your sponsors are going to be and how those sponsors are going to help your career. So you need to think about whether, is it best for me to stay in the same group I'm in at the moment, or is it best to move to a different group because they give me a different perspective on things? Some funders can get a bit funny about postdocs who have been with the same group for a significant amount of time, and because they like to see people moving and developing different perspectives. And also it can be quite tricky to obtain independence with the same sponsor who was your PhD supervisor, and then you became their postdoc. So how is it that you're going to actually become independent? And then letters of support, like from the head of department, are really important as well. These have to say the right things. So it can take a little time to actually get right. In terms of the application itself and they're submitting it, make sure you proofread it and you spell check it. I've just put the one line here, which is consult with someone with more experience. But in NHLI, we insist also that grants are peer reviewed prior to submission. And this is a really, really important thing. I mean, I really can't overemphasize it enough, especially for people that haven't done too many grant applications in the past. It's very easy to get the pitch wrong. What I've seen in the past is that postdocs are more junior academics who are on the bench and actually doing the work, tend to quite focus on how the work will be done. So the 5-page proposal of science that goes into the funder, it might have a page of background and 4 pages of how this work is going to be done. Very senior academics and senior professors, it flips around. So it'd be 4 pages of background and then 1 page of how the work will be done. And there's a sweet spot somewhere in the middle. So it doesn't need an infinite level of detail on the methodology. It needs enough that the panel could see how it was going to be done, but it needs enough background to understand why it's being done. So getting those things right and getting some peer review on it is really, really important. Making sure all the supporting evidence is there. Make sure you've done word counts and everything is correct from that point of view, and submit well before the deadlines. The one problem we have all the time in NHLI and across the faculty, and I'm sure across every university in the country, is grants coming in absolutely on the day of the deadline with problems on them. And it's sometimes the first time we've seen that grant application. And it can be a real challenge to get those problems ironed out and get the application in before the deadline. So if you take away nothing else from this, I would ask you, think about your grants so far in advance that you have it absolutely perfect by the time it goes in. And then that application goes off into some sort of electronic ether, and how it might feel that a funder makes a decision. You get an email from them 6 months later that says, thank you for your application, however, we're unable to fund it on this occasion. And it feels like a bit of a lottery going in. How things really happen when they go in. So you submit your application online, and it will probably almost certainly arrive first with somebody who's a more junior administrator in the funder. And what they'll do is they'll check your application over, make sure that you're eligible for it, that it's broadly within the remit of what the funder is looking for, and that the budgets look generally okay. And then the next step is really to send it out to referees. Virtually every grant that you're thinking of submitting will probably go to some level of referee. It might be that those are international experts in the field, or it might be that these are people on the funders panel if it's a small application or it's a quick turnaround type of application. From my personal own experience, these can often be very difficult to select. So if you have an opportunity to nominate referees, I would suggest take it up. Don't nominate people, though, that are your sponsor, your supervisor, or people that you published with in the past, certainly not for the last 5 or 6 years, because it'll be seen that you're trying to favour your own application and have it sent to people who might give you a smoother ride through the funder. So be sensible, select the referees in a sensible way. You sometimes also get an opportunity to say to people you don't want it refereed by. I would suggest only doing this if you genuinely have an issue with that person. Don't just reel off a whole list of people who maybe don't agree with your view scientifically, and you feel that it'd be better if they didn't see it. We're going back to the sort of few slides back where I mentioned giving a balanced view of the field. So only use that really, really as a last resort. You don't want to limit the pool. It can be really difficult to find referees, and response rates are not necessarily that high because everybody's busy, everybody's got a lot to do, and it may not be in that person's benefit to respond to a referee's request. Once those are being collated, and it can take several months to do that, the application will go to some sort of funding committee or board or panel, whatever that funder happens to call it, for their particular scheme. And that panel will read everything. As I say, some of the people on that panel will only read the abstract, but generally speaking, what will happen is you may have a panel of about 20 people, and 2, maybe 3 of them will read to your grant. So they will read through it in detail and have notes available. There'll then usually be a discussion about each grant application. That discussion may be quite lengthy, or it could be very short. It just really depends on the feeling of the committee, and they will have a lot of grants to get through in a relatively short period of time as well. The other thing to note here is that some committees are very broad. So the Wellcome Trust's Physiology Committee will have maybe 2 respiratory people on it, maybe a couple of cardiology people on it, but it will also have a rheumatologist, a dermatologist, the whole, the gamut of things that panel covers. So it's very important to get across to those people who would be non-experts why your research is important, to have them in your corner when it comes to, for example, ranking a grant application against all the others, so that they can decide which ones they can fund. If they've got a limited pot, they may only be able to fund the top 5. So it's important to make sure that all the people on that panel get on board and get to support your application. And then the final step is to get feedback to you on the grant, and usually that comes with the referees' reports as well. Things that they'll be considering when they are asked to look at the applications is the importance of the question. Is it novel and timely? It can be, and sitting on the welcome panel, and I'm sure some of our other academics will probably say similar things. There's quite a lot of Me Too science, and that's not particularly interesting to the panels when they've got limited budgets. So if somebody's done a particular project in one cell line, does replicating it in another cell line really give you much more novel information? Does it address an important issue? So that's where getting across the importance of your question is really critical in this. And is it feasible? So it might be that your research is really novel, it addresses a really important question, but if the approach isn't the right one, and it's just that you're using techniques you know to address the question rather than the techniques which might be the most appropriate, then you can fall down on that. Then they'll talk about the researchers, the applicants on the grant, whether you have the experience, have you delivered in the past? So there's times when they might look at your CV and see what publications you've had. So that's why it's important to keep a good pace of publications up. If they see there's a massive gap in your publications, maybe you haven't published anything for the last 3 years, it might raise questions about whether you can actually deliver on the project. And when you're talking about being given maybe £500,000, it's a lot of money to take on faith. And then there's things like the environment. So are all the facilities available? Do you have access to patients? The right type of animals or the right type of animal keeping? So these 3 things really break down as the project, the person, and the place. So these are the 3 things to think about all the time as you're putting the application together. And of course, they'll want to fund the best science with the best chance of success. Because at the end of the day, the funders and some of these charities we're talking about, BHF and CRUK, they have people standing out on the street rattling tins in order to raise money. If that money goes to research which doesn't produce anything and nothing comes from it, those people will have less and less opportunity to highlight the type of research they're doing and the outcomes that are coming from it, and their funding will probably trickle off a little bit. I gathered these, and I don't know if the Welcome Trust know I still have them, but these were genuine referees reports which came in at the time I was there. So I just thought I'd run through them because it gives a good example of the sort of things and comments that referees give. So first one, it involves techniques with which the applicants appear to have no prior experience and for which no preliminary data are proposed. So what they're saying is you don't have the experience of using this technique. So it might be the right technique, but you haven't got the experience of using it. So this way, bringing in a collaborator who would actually close that loop and make that referee unable to give you that comment. It does not appear to be hypothesis driven. There are no specific aims or objectives. Hypothesis is really important to get across really clearly. And it needs to be something that's testable. So just make sure that you've thought about that there are aims, there are objectives. You're showing what it is you're going to deliver from the project. One weakness is the proposal there's no alternative plan should the proposed approach not yield information relevant to the hypothesis proposed. So this is what I was going back to, identifying the problems before the referee gets there. So you can say, in this experiment, if this doesn't work, this is our backup plan. It might take a bit longer, or it might be a bit more expensive, but we've thought about it. We don't think it won't work, double negative, but we think it will work, and this is the reasons why we think it will work, or we've done it before in a sample of 5 patients, for example. An intriguing hypothesis, however, the experiments proposed for testing it will not provide unequivocal evidence for or against. So what they're saying is it's not the right experiments to do. So this might be a case where somebody's written a grant on a particular topic using the techniques that they know rather than ones that might be the right ones to answer the problem. Work described is overambitious, it cannot be achieved in a lifetime. So again, this is where fitting in to the scope of the project, a 3-year grant needs to have 3 years worth of work in it. And the same for if it's budget limited. Persuasive Writer has done a commendable job of marshalling evidence to support their hypothesis. However, the applicant has put aside facts that do not support their point of view. So this is probably the referee who wrote the other paper that contradicted your viewpoint on this particular topic. So making sure that that background covers all the points of view, and maybe give your theory about why the other point of view might not be correct. And I've always loved this one. This was actually a very lengthy referee's report, and it said this at the end of it. I only had one problem with this application. I had no idea what they were trying to do. So clearly, this applicant didn't put a very cohesive or explanatory application together. So we reached the bottom of that flow chart, and we can either go one way or the other. Hopefully it'll be funded. So this is where the hard work starts. You must ensure that you deliver on it, though, because you're only as good as your last grant application, and you're only as good as your last paper in a way. So your next grant to that funder will depend upon you delivering on the previous one. So the BHF will want to see that papers have arisen, they've been published, that you've conformed to things like open access, all these sort of technical things. And then they'll probably want to consider your next application. Wellcome Trust now, if you just to highlight, if you don't publish your papers in open access journals and deposit it on the right repositories, you won't get another grant from them. So there's all sorts of little technical things that you need to do. If any problems arise, it's best to contact funders early. People still leave it too late in the day, where the grant is basically at the end when there's problems have arisen. But do talk to the team in NHLI before going to funders. We may have ways that we can solve your problem for you without bringing in your funder. And sometimes highlighting problems to a funder is not necessarily the best way to deal with things. And much like publishing papers in open access journals, funders require final reports, often before the final payments are released. So your department will be on your back to do the final report as well, because they might be holding back 10, 15, 25% of the grants until that report is delivered. Applications are going to be rejected. It is absolutely inevitable that you're not going to get absolutely every single application funded. So try and look at it more positively, try and take advice on it. Look at the referee's comments critically. It's very easy to look at referees' comments when you get a rejection and say, oh, they don't know what they're talking about, and just ditch them completely and ignore them. I'm sure there will be comments in there that are accurate and are correct. You might not agree with every single one of them, but it's good information to learn from. And discuss it with scientific colleagues and your peers as well, to see what they think about it. Sometimes reading the referee's report is informative, not always, and there are particular things you can take from that. And maybe that's the time when you go and speak to somebody who you haven't collaborated with previously. Or come and speak to me. We can have a look through it, see where the problems might have arisen, and possibly go and speak to the funder. Obviously, that's a little bit more difficult at the moment, or potentially easier, depending on the funder themselves. But often they'll be more than happy to have a brief conversation with you to highlight any issues. And sometimes there might be things that they're happy to say face to face that they wouldn't necessarily want to put in writing. So do have a conversation with them. I would say actually as well, before key fellowship applications, it's sometimes worth having a word with the funder to make sure that what you're proposing really fits with what they're looking for. So you could then refocus your question, your proposal. You could change what you're doing slightly. You could consider whether it's the right funder for the work that you're proposing. And really the worst case scenario is to file that grant away. Maybe it's before its time and it's something you can come back to later on. Very rarely is a grant to be ditched completely. So try and learn from those rejections, try and recycle and innovate each time and move on to the next one. In terms of NHLI funding schemes that are out there that you might want to make applications to, what I'd highlight is that we treat these in the same way that an application going to an external funder would be treated. So some people feel that they get a hard time running through the NHLI Travel Awards, but we get a lot of applications for these, and we really do try and make them a replica of the way that funding works in the external world as well. So Travel Awards are for going to conferences when you're presenting and there's no other funding available, and the Pilot Awards are for postdocs who want to develop some preliminary data for their own fellowship or project application in the future. And I really want to emphasize that these are the work that is different to what is going on in the lab already. These are not little top-up grants for projects that you're involved with at the moment. They're really to get you moving in a slightly different stream to where your supervisor is working. We have had these both on hiatus over the COVID period, because obviously there are very few conferences going on at the moment, those which are virtual. And with the Pilot Awards, it's hard to get into the labs, but things are returning to normal. So we're going to reinitiate these schemes probably relatively soon. The other thing I wanted to highlight to you all is a thing called iDocs Grant Finder. And this is a system that the college has a contract for, and it's basically a database of all funding opportunities. So I would say if you're looking for grants, go onto this. The link there will explain how to access it, and set up an alert for yourself, which has got schemes or subjects of area which you're interested in. And then I think about once a week you'll get an email update from them, highlighting all the things that have been identified. And I think you can do it so it's all that are currently active or any that are newly added. We used to run this in NHLI as an email alert when Sarah Marquez, those of you that know her, was here. But it's just easier, I think, if you try and operate this yourself. We don't have the central resources to try and pull this together. And obviously a shout out to the Postdoc and Fellows Development Centre. They're there to support all postdocs and fellows in Imperial, and they will try and review your applications. Not review your applications, but help you with mock interviews and things of that type. The feedback I get is that the mock interviews are very useful, but can be quite non-scientific. So what we try and do is couple their more non-scientific mock interviews with a very scientific one in the department. So if you get shortlisted for interview, let me know absolutely as soon as you hear, and we'll start putting mock interviews together for you. And I think that was all I had. I tried to leave as much time as I could for questions. So I will turn that off, and yeah, I think we can have questions if there are any, Miriam.
Thank you very much, Alan. So people, you can either, as Alex has said, put your hand up or actually ask a question in the chat, and Alan will respond. Just to emphasise, when going for fellowships, and if you get to interview stage, I can't emphasize enough the importance of having an interview practice. You know, maybe up to 3 practices, they will make a world of difference. Alun not only arranges one within NHLI, but often the Faculty of Medicine as well will also arrange an additional one. I'm also going to put in the chat line the link for next Friday's webinar. But I'll pass back to Alun to answer your questions.
Lots of stunned silence.
Got a hand up from Anthony, I can see.
Oh, hi, thanks for the advice and the talk today. It was really fantastic, actually. I was wondering, is there unanimity on the notion of submitting similar grants to different bodies, or is it an absolute no-no on every front?
No, you can sometimes submit multiple applications to do different funders on the same science at the same time. It usually is around fellowships, though. So, sorry, I've got somebody trying to call me, so let's try and stop that. Fellowship applications, the funders generally recognise that the chances of success are quite low. So, for example, you might submit to the Wellcome and the MRC and possibly the BHF, all for the same broad level of science at the same time. What generally you can't do is submit project grants to the same place, to different places at the same time.
Okay, super, thanks. I've got another quick question as well, which hopefully doesn't make me seem arrogant, but I'll throw it in anyway, because it almost contradicts one of the other pieces of advice you had. But if you did have a legitimate rebuttal against a claim made by a reviewer, is there any mechanism to challenge them formally, or is it just something that you take on the chin and then move on with?
No, it's I say it's variable. The quality of the reviews that you get back. Sometimes you look at it and you go, yeah, okay, fair cop. And other times it is a bit out of place. So you can challenge them. Usually what would happen is it would go back in as a new application with a rebuttal attached to it. Some funders don't like resubmitting the same grant within 9 to 12 month period. So you'd have to speak to them and get basically their permission to reapply on that basis. But we have seen it in the past where a referee's report is outrageously wrong, and that does need to be challenged, because it does need to be highlighted to the funder as well that referee may be giving spurious comments back. I'm sure 90% of the time the panels recognise that and would identify it before it got to a decision point, but it does happen.
Thanks so much.
And I was wondering if you could comment, because obviously there is this slight unique scenario for all other grant bodies applications, as you said, NHI policy needs to be peer reviewed, but when it comes to MRC, it's actually done at a higher level, at the Faculty of Medicine level.
Yeah,
and I think that came about, wasn't it, because of feedback from the MRC that noticed that Imperial was not having much success. Maybe you could just comment, because again, it's purely to assist people in success.
That's right. So the MRC, all MRC project, program and new investigative research grants have to go through faculty level shadow committee, and that has to happen about 7 weeks before the deadline. You have to submit your entire grant as if you were submitting to the funder to the shadow committee. And this came about because, as Miriam said, our success rate with the MRC was dropping and dropping and dropping. And basically the MRC came back to the college and said, you, Imperial, either need to sort this out internally, or we will limit the number of applications that are coming through to MRC. Will only take 10 per round or some figure like that. So the faculty put the shadow panel in place. And since then, I think our success rate has gone up quite significantly. So it seems to be a great success from that point of view. So just getting independent views on this, and generally what the people on those shadow committees are people who have recently been on MRC or other funder panels and really know what they're looking at. And it also helps in terms of getting applications completed nice and early. So you get a lot of feedback on the application before you actually submit it. NHLI has a slightly lighter touch-up process for its all other grants, but that the MRC is the exceptional particular one.
And we're hoping for the third webinar that we'll also have someone who sits on the college panel, so they can talk about the number of applications they see, the success rate, and their perspective from it. I was going to make one other comment, but it's more because of some experience with the Wellcome Trust, and when I've encouraged members of the team going forward with fellowship applications, is often there's various boards and certain panels, and sometimes you're not always sure which is the best panel. And often as well, it's good to get in contact earlier with them and send your very up-to-date CV, highlighting you're thinking of applying, for example, for the Henry Dale, the suitability of your, how eligible you are, how competitive you are. They will often give feedback and also advise if you're not sure which panel would be the most appropriate to badge your fellowship under. So again, the certainly, and I'm sure it's the same now for many of the funding bodies, they're really proactive in wanting to help the early career scientists get onto that successful ladder and travel upwards. So, I
mean, generally speaking, if you accidentally apply to the wrong panel, they will pass your application over to the correct panel. The problem then is that you might have pitched your application for that panel's expertise and knowledge and remit, and then if it's moved somewhere else, that could be problematic for your application. So it is worth speaking to and make sure that you are in the right spot, as it were, within the funders' streams. The other thing is, of course, Miriam, that you need preliminary applications for a lot of fellowships.
Yeah.
Wellcome or Sir Henry Dale, you have to submit an outline, and it's important that that outline is also reviewed and is right, because what they're expecting to see is an application that's very similar to that outline. It's more or less the same budget and it asks the same questions. If you submit your outline and then suddenly change your mind and develop a completely different application, they may actually throw that application out and say, no, this isn't what we approved in terms of the outline. So it's important to get the outlines correct and get them reviewed as well. A lot of people are coming in to me very late, maybe a week before the outline deadline, saying, oh, I'm applying for the Sir Henry Dale, here's my outline. And it's like, has anybody else seen it? No, but I'll correct it when it goes to full application. That's not good practice at all. It's far better to get it done in steps and get it right all the way through.
Yeah, in essence, the prelim is the same as the full. You have to have an info ed costing. It has to be approved by the RO. And I think that's the important thing I'd say to everyone is, when it comes to costing, Alan hasn't gone into the fine detail of full economic costing, but you have
That's a whole other seminar.
Yes, you have, but just to sort of give an indication, you have to think that when it comes to costing, you're not just costing for the reagents and the plasticware that you use in the lab and the individual employee, but you have to also, and this is part of the indirect direct costs, think that, all the buildings we occupy in NHLI, there's an electric bill, there's a water bill, there's a gas bill, and your grant has to contribute to a percentage, and that's those costs that you may not realise or appreciate. And so that's why, as Alan said, if you're thinking, I hope many of you are, of putting applications in, talking to your section head administrator, just saying, how much is it to, have a person for this amount of time, and then you'll actually see what the overall costs involved are.
And the cost will vary by funder as well. So the cost for a fellowship to Wellcome Trust will be completely different to the cost to the MRC, for example. So, the price will be, get my wording correct.
But this is why we're so lucky having, such a fabulous administrative team at NHLI to support us in going through these. I mean, I rely on them as well. And it's not fixed. You work on an info edge. You can say, oh, actually, okay, I'm not going to be able to afford to have a pair of hands for the full 3 years helping me. But actually, I'd want to advertise and get them in 6 months in, and that will save me a bit of money that then I can cover the consumables. So you go through iterations of your own costing, and I know that myself from experience, and I'm sure a few of you who've been involved in applications similarly are aware of that.
Yeah, and the bigger the application, the longer it takes to get it honed down and get it correct.
Yeah.
If it's a £5,000-10,000 application, it should be a fairly simple process. But if it's a multi-centre project grant or program grant or an initiative, it'll take quite a while to get it right.
Well, I don't think there are any further hands up. There's no further questions in the chat line. I think everyone's been given a lot to think about and some really important aspects from your insights of having worked as a scientific programme officer at the Wellcome and knowing the traps people fall into.
If anybody wants to ask questions they don't feel like asking in a broad thing, they can always contact me directly.
Yeah, that goes without saying.
Either through Teams or by email.
But I'd like to just finally thank you once again, Alan, and also to thank Alex, who's set the whole teams up and emailed everyone. And I hope you all continue to keep safe and well, and hopefully some of you will be able to join us next Friday at 3 p.m. To 4 p.m. when Ryan and Charis will be presenting at the NHLI Science and Culture webinar. In the meantime, have a good rest of your working day, and thank you so much for joining us. Take care.